Hello again everyone, Jessica with From Dream to Seed, and today I have a video answering one of the most common questions I get from new gardeners, and that is, how do I properly water my garden? So in my opinion, I think that most failures with new gardeners have to do with watering, whether that's overwatering or underwatering or just not properly watering in the first place, and I will show you what I mean by that. But water is super vital to plants. It's how they uptake nutrients from the soil, and it's also how they have what's called turgor, and that just means that they have a firmness in their stems and leaves. They're not droopy, they're standing nice and tall. And so water is extremely important. And it's extremely important that we provide the proper amount of water to plants, and also that we give it to them in the proper ways. So question number one is, how much water does your garden actually need? And so roughly, and this is for mature plants, your plants need 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. Well, if you're like me in the beginning, I thought, okay, great, but what does that actually mean? How much water is that? Does that mean that I just water until the top 1 to 1.5 inches of soil are wet? And no, that's not what that means. So what that actually means is, if this raised bed behind me was a giant bathtub instead of a raised bed, it's how much water would it take for me to fill this tub 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and it's quite a bit of water. So for every square foot of garden, it's a little bit over 1/2 gallon. So say you have a 32 square foot raised bed, that's roughly 20 gallons of water per week, and that's quite a bit. So we want to make sure that we're giving them enough water. So one of the questions I get is, well, if it rains, does that mean I need to water? And the question is, maybe, maybe not. Most of the time, it does not rain enough that it actually properly waters your garden. Most of the time you'll get like a heavy downpour, but it's not sustained for long enough, or you may get a little bit of a sustained sprinkle, but it's just not getting deep enough into the garden. So one of the ways that you can tell how much water your garden actually gets when it rains is to get a rain gauge. So this is a really inexpensive rain gauge that I have in my garden. You can tell it's filthy because I literally just pulled it out of my garden, but we had a really heavy downpour last night, like several in fact. And so in my mind I think, okay, well, it probably rained enough to water my garden. But if you can look and see, it actually didn't even get up to 1/2 inch. Now there has been some evaporation that has happened since then, but it's not enough for me to not water my garden for the rest of the week. So you can get these off Amazon or find them in a lot of big box stores, but this is just a rain gauge. It's a simple way to tell how much water you've gotten for that rainfall. And another thing you can use is just your hands. So what I will do is I will put my finger down into the soil, and if that soil is still wet, 1 inch, 2 inches down, I know I don't need to water just yet. But if it's dry several inches down, I know my garden is probably in need of a watering. I think most new gardeners, and this included me when I first started gardening, have a tendency to overwater their mature plants because we're so worried that we're going to kill our plants, or they look a little droopy, or we know we need to water plants in order for them to survive. But the problem with overwatering is, especially if you live in an area like I do where we have a lot of humidity and there's a lot of fungal diseases that are prevalent, if you're constantly watering that garden, you're getting water on the leaves and on the stems, and that's just a recipe for fungus to grow. Another reason is, if you're always watering just a little bit on top, you're never giving it those deep waterings, all the roots will stay right on the surface of that soil. So for instance, for a tomato plant, they have roots that like to go deep. But if you're only ever watering on the top couple inches of soil, those roots are going to stay where the water is. They're going to stay in the top couple inches. And so you're not going to get a very strong foundation, a very strong root hold to that plant. It could topple over easily, and it's not going to be very healthy, because usually the top several inches of the soil are the warmest of the soil. And so you want those roots to go deep down where the soil is much more cool. So the name of the game, sort of your mantra for gardening, is you want to have, for mature plants, for most plants, you want to have deep, infrequent waterings. So for example, tomatoes, carrots, potatoes, some of these plants that have really deep root systems, you want deep and frequent waterings. My tomatoes and carrots, I usually only water about once a week, even in the heat of the summer. I give them a lot of water. I make sure I'm thoroughly soaking that bed all the way through, and then I wait about a week. And your plants will tell you when they need water. They will start to get a little bit droopy, and don't worry, most plants can bounce back fairly quickly from being a little droopy. Obviously, you don't want them to completely dry out, but if your plants are showing a little bit of drooping, then you can give them a water and watch. They'll bounce back fairly quickly. So it's important to remember that deep and frequent watering is really important for most mature plants. However, there are some plants that require different water amounts, and in plants in different stages will definitely require different watering needs. So I'm going to take you along and show you a few different plants at a few different stages, and I'll show you sort of some of the differences in watering that these plants might need. So here we have my tomato bed, and this is an example of a plant that really loves that deep and frequent watering because they have roots that go really, really deep. And I tend to interplant carrots and tomatoes, and I do that because they have really similar watering needs as well as fertilizing needs. But that is a tip for you. If you can kind of group plants together and how they like to be watered, that'll make watering a lot easier for you, because then you can just focus on watering one whole bed rather than individually watering certain plants. So another reason I wanted to show you my tomato bed is since tomatoes are probably something a lot of people are growing, is when you see the curling of these tomato leaves, this sort of upward curl. So you can see the leaves are curling upward. This is really, really common in tomatoes, and it doesn't have anything to do, well, usually doesn't have anything to do with a watering need. So you can see that I have a lot of leaves that are curling on this tomato plant, but I can tell that it's not a watering issue because I can feel in the stems, they're nice and firm. They're not drooping. I mean, they're pointing downwards, but they're not drooping. They're very, very firm. So you know, if this was a watering issue, these stems would be very flexible. I could bend them a lot. So I know that this in my area is a heat response. This is something the plant does to conserve energy and to help protect the plant when it's really, really hot and we're having 100-degree heat index days. And certain varieties are more prone to it than others. So this is an old world German, but you can see over here on my carbon tomato that it's not really having that issue. So certain varieties are more prone to it, but this isn't necessarily a watering issue. Now this can be indicative of other things, especially if you have a downward curl. It could be a disease or a pest problem, but for the most part, if you're getting fruit, if the leaves are nice and green, if you're not seeing pests on the plants, or you're not seeing, and you know you're watering well, you've got a lot of firmness to those stems, this is just simply a response to the heat. So when it comes to watering these tomatoes, you want to make sure that you are watering the base of the plant. You are never overhead watering. Overhead watering can really cause a lot of damage on these tomato plants. It can cause fungal diseases. With overhead watering, you get a lot of splashing up from the soil, and in the soil is where these funguses live. And so if you're splashing that water up onto the leaves, you're allowing the fungus from the soils to get onto the leaves and then infect your plants. So you want to make sure that you're watering gently and deeply at the base of the plant, so no overhead watering. Also, if you are watering in the middle of the day, so that's a really good point to make too. When is the best time to water your plants? And that is early in the morning is the best time when it's nice and cool. The second best time would be early afternoon, or late afternoon to early evening. And the third best time to water your plants is when they need it. So if you come out and if this tomato plant was really, really droopy, if it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm not going to wait until the end of the day to water that plant. It might be dead by then. So the third best time is to water when your plants really, really need the watering. But you don't want to, another reason you don't want to overhead water, especially in the middle of the day, is if you have water droplets on these leaves, it can actually act as little tiny magnifying glasses, and it can burn the leaves. So that's another reason why overhead watering, especially in the middle of the day, isn't a great idea. So watering at the base of the plant where the roots go, not overhead watering. So here I have some cantaloupe and I have some sugar baby watermelons that I just started from seed less than a week ago. So when you are planting things from seed, it is really important that you do water those every day, or at least you are keeping the soil moist. Those seedlings cannot dry out as they're germinating. It will kill the seed. So if you have seeds in the ground or in the raised bed or in pots, wherever you're growing them, you have to make sure that that soil stays moist. So it may, if you're growing like I am right now and it's really, really hot, you may need to come out and definitely water that soil a little bit every day. Now, once those seeds germinate, so right here I have a watermelon that just germinated, and I'm hoping the other ones are going to pop up soon. After that, you can start to back off a little bit on the watering. Now, these are young plants. The roots are very, very small on these plants. So remember, that top few inches of the soil is what's going to dry out more quickly. So when the seedlings start to emerge, I will back that off to water them every other day, and as they start to grow, I will back off and water, give it that more deep and frequent watering that the more mature plants will be. So seeds germinating and seedlings have a much different watering need than mature plants will. So here I have cucumbers, and this is a really good of an example of a plant that is a mature or maturing plant, but it has much different watering needs than my tomato plants will. So there are some mature plants that still like those deep and frequent waterings. However, the frequency of that deep watering is a little bit more than a tomato would be. So my tomato plants, my carrots, my potatoes, they will get watered deeply about once a week, maybe even longer, just depending on the temperature. However, things like cucumbers, any kind of green vegetable, leafy vegetable, so lettuces, kale, spinach, those type of things, they have very, very shallow root systems, and especially cucumbers. Obviously a cucumber is made mostly of water, so it requires a lot of water for these things to do well. So with my cucumbers, I still don't water them every day. I still wait until that soil dries out, but I will wait until that soil dries out, maybe only the first inch, maybe two, before I'll water it again. So with my cucumbers, I will probably water these in the dead heat of summer 3, maybe 4 times a week, just depending on the temperature. So let's talk about a few other things to consider when it comes to gardening. Now, I showed you about watering in my raised beds, and I use mainly soaker hoses in my raised beds to water. But I also do a lot of container gardening. Now, if you've watched my container gardening 101 video, if you haven't, I'll link it above. You know that you will probably need to water, not probably, you will need to water much more frequently in containers than you will in a raised bed or an in-ground garden. And that's because of the medium that you are growing in drains very, very quickly. It's made of almost completely organic materials, and so water will move through that extremely fast. So when you're growing things, bigger plants, especially like these peppers or tomatoes, you will need to water those quite frequently. And I usually water these at least every day in the summer. As they get extremely mature and have a lot of fruit, sometimes I might even need to go in and water twice a day. It depends on the size of your container, the size of your plant, and what it's producing. Now, the bigger the container, the less you're going to need to water. This is a fairly small container for this. Let's see, this is a peppercini, so it's not going to get huge, but I still will need to water this quite often. Now, one of the things that you can do to cut back on your watering is mulch. So you can see I have pine needles that I put on almost all of my containers, and that allows it allows the soil to stay a little bit more moist and cool underneath, so that will help retain a lot of the moisture. It'll help keep the plant more happy, and it'll help keep me happy because I'm not having to constantly come out and water. So as far as watering in your containers, same thing as in your raised beds. You want to avoid any overhead watering. So I'm not a huge fan of sprinkler systems being used to water things like vegetable gardens or really any gardens if you can avoid it, because all you're going to get is that overhead watering. You're not going to get the water to where it really needs to be, which is down at the base of the plant. So whether I'm using a watering container or whether I'm using a hose-in sprayer, I want to make sure that I'm getting down to the base of that plant, and you want to water until you see water coming out the drainage holes at the bottom. And again, if you watch that video, you know that you must have drainage holes in the bottoms of all these containers. It seems like it would make sense to not have drainage holes so that it would hold on to more water, but unfortunately what that happens is the roots are getting too wet, they're sitting in that water all the time, and you can get rot. So you always want to have drainage holes in the bottom. So when you're watering, make sure that you are watering until you see water start coming out the bottom of that pot. So now let's talk about a few things you can do that will help you cut back on the amount of watering you're having to do. One of the things you can do is mulch. I'm a huge fan of using non-dyed, undyed, I guess is a better word, undyed hardwood mulch, because as it breaks down, it feeds the soil. But whatever you have, whether that's mulch or straw, or some people have rock. I'm not a huge fan. I get the ease of it and the benefit, but it doesn't feed the soil. But whatever you have, any kind of mulching will definitely help retain that water. It keeps the evaporation from occurring on the top level of that soil. But one of the issues you run into with mulch is if you have very, very thick layers of mulch, and I try to keep mine about 3 to 4 inches, no bigger, or no deeper rather. So if you have large amounts of mulch, it's hard for the water to get down to the plants. So a couple things you can do. Number one is, again, you can grab one of these long-handled hose end sprayers, and don't mind my Shasta daisies, they are in really bad need of deadheading, but just pretend that they look really good. Is use these long-handled sprayers, because this again allows you to get down to the base of the plant and water where the water really needs to go. And as I mulch, I try not to you don't want that mulch pushed up to the base of the plant. You want to keep an area around the plant a little bit closer than the drip line, which means the circumference of the plant, because you don't want that wet mulch sitting against the base of the plant, where it can cause rotting and fungal issues, and also pest issues as well. So you want to water down at the base of that plant where you're getting the water to the roots. Another thing you can do is I have drip line installed on almost all of my perennial beds, and if you're curious about a video about soaker hoses or drip lines, emitter hoses, then comment below and I'd love to show you a video about that as well. But I have emitter hosing on, this is my front landscaping. And this runs underneath the mulch, so the water's getting down to the plants. And I am not tech savvy. This was super easy to install, so if I can do it, anyone can. But this is my main drip line, and I'll insert some close-ups here. And then I have a couple small 1/4 inch hosing going off to some of the other plants if I need them to. But this is really great because, number one, it allows me to water hands-free. I just simply hook up the water line to it and let it run. You can put them on timers if you can keep them hooked up all the time. So this is a great way to water if you're on vacation. It's hands-free, and I really like it. So the more beds I add, the more need I have to add these hands-free watering. But again, either emitter hoses underneath the mulch if you have a thick layer of mulch, or using a long-handled sprayer or bending down to get that water right at the base of the plant. Whew, getting sweaty. Another thing you can do to help reduce your watering frequency is to add compost to your garden. And I know I say this every video, but honestly, it's one of the best things you can do for any garden, whether you're planting flowers or perennials or fruits and vegetables. So this is my perennial flower bed, and I just laid a layer of fresh compost on this. I'm getting ready to lay emitter hosing down, and then I'll be mulching over top of that. But compost is such a great material for garden beds, especially when it comes to water, because it's like a sponge. It will hold on to water, but it also won't cause the soil to retain so much water. So it creates this perfect balance of water retention and drainage that's great for your plants. So a lot of times, especially in my vegetable beds, my mulch is compost. That's what I use. I lay a thick 3 to 4 inch layer of compost on my beds in the spring, sometimes again in the fall if I think I need it, and that pretty much acts as my mulch. But when it comes to my perennial beds where I'm having to water a lot less or hoping to water a lot less, I will mulch on top of that as well. But this compost will eventually kind of sink down into the soil. Of course you can till it in if you like, but it will create a medium in the soil that is the perfect balance, like I said, of drainage and water retention. And so using compost is a great way to help reduce your watering needs. So another thing you can do to reduce watering needs, particularly in a vegetable garden, is to high intensity plant. And this just means that you are planting plants very close together. And so for instance, I have kale growing here. It was planted very close together. And because it's growing so tightly packed, it's shading the soil, which means the soil isn't going to dry out as quickly as it would as if I had large pockets of the soil kind of in between each plant. And so it's getting plenty of sunlight on the canopy where it needs to get sunlight on the greenery, but down below, that soil is staying nice and cool, it's staying nice and moist, and so I'm not having to water these as much. And you can do this with any leafy green, really. Lettuces, kale, spinach. You can do it with green beans, really. There are certain plants that you wouldn't want to do this with. So bigger plants that have big, kind of those immense root systems like tomatoes, you know, things like that that are gonna, it'll cause more harm than good to plant those super close together. But things like leafy greens, they're not prone to the fungal diseases that tomatoes and bigger plants will get, so they don't mind the crowding to a certain extent. But I definitely plant these pretty tightly packed anytime I'm doing any kind of green vegetable, and that definitely reduces my need to water these as much. So just to recap, you want to make sure that you're accounting for the specific needs of the plants in your garden. Seeds, planting seeds, you definitely want to keep those watered and the soil moist all the time. As the seedlings emerge and as they grow bigger, you want to start cutting back on that watering a little bit every day. And as the plants mature, you want to remember deep, infrequent watering, but also accounting for the specific watering needs of those plants. Make sure you mulch, make sure you use compost, and make sure you are watering at the base of the plant and not over top. So I hope this video was helpful to answer some of your beginning gardener or even advanced gardener watering questions. If you have any other questions or anything that I didn't cover, please leave them in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer as many as I can. And if you have any other ideas for videos or anything specific you'd like me to do, please let me know and I will see you next time. Bye.